A sharp, air-ripping screech announced disaster. Under the morning Texas sun, which hadn't yet become scorching, a wagon raced uncontrollably along a bumpy road. The horses, a pair of bays with eyes full of wild terror, galloped with all their might, heedless of the path, their hooves kicking up clouds of reddish dust. On the box, gripping the reins that cut her palms, sat a young woman, Eleanor Vance, whose features spoke of determination and strength, but whose bitter chocolate-colored eyes were now filled with pure, unadulterated terror. Her light, almost wheat blonde hair, once in a neat bun, had come loose and now streamed in the wind like golden ribbons. She wore a dark green traveling dress, practical but made of expensive fabric, which had already become covered with a layer of dust. Her hands, despite their apparent fragility, held the reins tightly, and her elegant boots were braced against the wagon's floorboards. The horse's strength was immeasurable compared to her own. The reins writhed like snakes, and the wagon seemed on the verge of falling apart. Every pothole, every stone on the road sent it flying, threatening to throw her off at any second. As if in slow motion, she saw one of the wheels break with a crunch and a crack, and the wagon tilted, inexorably falling onto its side. Her body, thrown by the force of inertia, was launched into the air. The world turned upside down. Dust, the blue sky, the galloping horses, and finally, emptiness. At the very moment the ground was supposed to meet her with merciless force, she found herself in strong, reliable arms. The smell of leather, gunpowder, and the clean step wind hit her nostrils, and she instinctively clung to the stranger. Caleb Thorne, a man for whom the Wild West was home, not a temporary stop, had seen the trouble from afar. His horse, a faithful Mustang named Colt, was a match for its owner, fast, smart, and fearless. Hearing the roar and seeing the trail of dust, he rode to intercept, arriving at the last possible moment. His broad, dependable shoulders were covered by a faded denim jacket, and on his head sat an old, but sturdy cowboy hat that slightly shaded his tanned, weathered face. His eyes, piercing blue like the clear sky above the prairie, looked at her with a striking mix of calm and resolve. They were now focused on Eleanor, who clung to him as if her life depended on it. Holding her tightly, he gently lowered them both to the ground, trying not to drop her. The dust from the broken wagon, now lying a dozen feet away, its wheels pointing uselessly skyward, still hung in the air. Next to it lay the mangled cargo crates, chests, and various belongings. Eleanor's heart pounded in her chest. She looked up to thank her savior, and her eyes met his. A second of confusion, a moment full of unsaid words, but their silence was broken by a new sound, the cracking of wood. One of the chests, split in half by the impact, spilled its contents onto the ground. They weren't possessions, but piles of yellowed documents written in small handwriting. One of them, sealed with wax, stood out. Eleanor, as if mesmerized, took a step toward it, but Caleb stopped her, gesturing to one of the broken axles. Where the wood should have been smooth, there was a jagged, fresh cut, as if someone had made several cuts to weaken the wood. This wasn't an accident. It was deliberate. Someone wanted this wagon to never reach its destination. Eleanor's eyes narrowed, and terror was replaced by fury. Clenching her fists, she looked back at the mangled wagon and the scattered documents. Her anger wasn't directed at Caleb, it was aimed at whoever had done this. She remembered the last stop, the faces of strangers who had watched her wagon with curiosity. Rage was etched on her face, as if she could see the perpetrator before her. Caleb, watching her, immediately understood that something was wrong. This woman wasn't just the victim of an accident. Someone was hunting her and her cargo. There was no surprise on his face, only a calm, predatory focus that revealed him to be a man accustomed to danger. He walked over to one of the crates and, bending down, carefully lifted it. The crate was light, but something rattled inside. Opening it, he saw several empty whiskey bottles, wrapped in old newspapers. That's why they chose this place, he muttered to himself, his gaze returning to the broken wheel. Ignoring his words, Eleanor approached the scattered papers. She began to gather them, her movements quick and frantic. "These papers, they're very important," she whispered, her voice trembling with suppressed anger. She picked up the thickest document. It was a land deed. Vast tracts of land, rich pastures, and, judging by the map, with a small stream that could water an entire herd. The plot belonged to her late father, whom she barely knew, and for whom she had embarked on this perilous journey. Suddenly, a sound reached them that made both of them freeze. A distant but clear sound of hooves, approaching from the direction of the town. It wasn't just one horse, there were several. Caleb straightened up sharply, his hand instinctively resting on the handle of the revolver at his hip. He didn't take his eyes off the horizon, where a cloud of dust was already visible. "Two of them, maybe three," he said, his voice low and even. Eleanor, pressing the papers to her chest, looked at him in horror. She understood. They knew where she would be and were waiting. Or rather, they were waiting for the accident to happen. Now that she had survived, they were surely coming to finish what they started. A fire of rage flashed in her eyes, but it was mixed with cold determination. She couldn't let them take what was rightfully hers. "We have to go," she said, her voice firm despite her fear. "These documents have to get to Fort Smith." Caleb nodded. He looked at his faithful colt, who stood calmly chewing grass, then at Eleanor, who was the embodiment of grace in the midst of chaos. Her appearance, soft features, slender fingers, and aristocratic posture was completely at odds with her current situation. This was a woman who had never faced such a wild and cruel world, but now an inner fire was awakening within her. Caleb knew it wouldn't be easy, but he also knew he wouldn't abandon her. Not now, at least. He held out his hand to her. "Come on, my camp is nearby. We can rest there and come up with a plan. But we don't have time. They're close." Eleanor, without hesitation, took his hand. Her anger, directed at her unknown enemy, was now the only force driving her. She was ready to fight for her inheritance, even if she had to go through hell. The sound of hooves grew clearer. Caleb immediately turned, grabbed Eleanor's hand, and pulled her along, not giving her time to recover. "Faster. They've spotted us," he said, his voice low and commanding, brooking no argument. Eleanor, clutching the priceless papers in her other hand, could barely keep up with him. Each step sent a jolt of pain through her strained ankle, and her lungs, accustomed to the clean air of eastern cities, now burned from the dust and heavy breathing. She stumbled over stones, caught on thorny bushes, but she didn't let go of the documents and followed Caleb as if he were her only lifeline in this ocean of chaos. The anger that had flared moments ago now gave way to a chilling fear and a piercing pain. She felt her body and spirit breaking under the onslaught of a wild, unfamiliar world. Caleb led her deeper into the prairie, away from the road where they would be easy to track. He was fast and silent as a shadow, as if his very existence was part of this merciless landscape. His movements were economical and precise. He didn't take a single unnecessary step. He ran crouched, like a wolf on a trail. His muscular legs easily navigated the uneven ground, and his eyes seemed to see everything around him. He didn't look back, but Eleanor felt that he knew exactly where their pursuers were. After hiding behind a low ridge of hills, Caleb slowed down. He quickly scanned the area, his gaze sweeping the sky and the ground as if he were reading some invisible map. "We have to lose them," he whispered, looking over the terrain. His eyes fell on a small creek winding in the distance. It was a thin silver trail on the brown backdrop of the earth, and their footprints led to it, clearly imprinted in the soft dust. "We'll follow the water," he said, his voice devoid of emotion, just pure strategy. Eleanor, without asking questions, obediently followed him. Step by step, she waded into the cold, clear water. Caleb walked ahead, his strides long and confident. Eleanor struggled to keep up. Her legs ached, her shoes were soaked, and every step was difficult. The water, although shallow, felt icy. Her shoes were not made for this, and her feet were rubbed raw and bleeding. But she endured, gritting her teeth and clutching the precious papers. Now, she had no right to be weak. She looked at Caleb's broad back, her only support, and felt despair rising within her. She, Eleanor Vance, the daughter of a respected businessman who had always lived in comfort and wealth, was now running for her life from unknown pursuers in a wild land. Walking along the creek, they went around several large stones. Caleb crouched behind one, pulling Eleanor with him, and they, hidden, held their breath. A few seconds later, 3 riders galloped past them on the road. Their horses were breathing heavily, and the riders' faces were hidden behind dust masks. They were racing at full speed, searching for their tracks, but not noticing them in the water. Eleanor felt a cold sweat run down her back. These weren't just robbers, they were after her. Someone wanted very badly for her not to reach Fort Smith. Her father had always said he had enemies, but she never thought it would affect her. After the sound of hooves faded, Caleb gave them a few more minutes to ensure they were safe. Then he stood up and nodded to Eleanor. "Let's go. My camp is close now." They continued on, and Eleanor felt the pain in her legs and soul becoming unbearable. She felt not like a human, but an animal trapped in a snare. It was humiliating, but her pride, which had always been her main trait, was now irrelevant. All that mattered was survival. Finally, they got out of the creek and walked on dry ground. Caleb walked ahead without turning back. She felt small, insignificant, and completely helpless. At last, they came to a small rock ledge. Before them, a small, hidden oasis opened up. There was a cave, concealed by wild blackberry bushes, and a small waterfall. It was a place only a very cautious and experienced person could find. It was quiet all around. Only the sound of the water broke the silence. Caleb gestured toward the cave entrance. "Go on. You need to rest." Eleanor, exhausted and weak, didn't argue. She went inside. It was dark but cool. Caleb started a small fire, and in its light, Eleanor saw that he was covered in dust. His clothes were torn in several places, and he had a deep scratch on his arm. She felt a pang of guilt. He had saved her, and now because of her, he was also in danger. She sat down by the fire and was finally able to relax. Her legs ached, and she felt weak. She carefully unrolled the documents. She had been clenching so tightly that her fingerprints were imprinted on them. And suddenly, she saw something on one of the documents that pierced her more deeply than any physical injury. On one of the pages, over her father's signature, was a seal. It was barely visible, but Eleanor recognized it. It was the family crest of her uncle, Nathaniel Vance, her father's brother. Surprise gave way to deep pain. These weren't just robbers. It was a member of her own family. Someone she was supposed to trust. Someone who had always been by her father's side. Eleanor closed her eyes, and an image of her smiling uncle, who had always been so kind to her, gave her gifts, and taught her to play chess, came to mind. And now he was her main enemy. Her heart ached with resentment and disappointment. Caleb, watching her from a distance, saw her face turn pale and her eyes fill with unbearable pain. He walked over to her and, without a word, held out a flask. Eleanor looked up at him, her eyes full of tears. She couldn't speak. She just took the flask, took a sip, and a new, even deeper resolve appeared on her face. She hadn't just lost her wagon, she had lost her faith in her family, in people. But this pain gave birth to a new, indomitable desire. She had to prove them wrong, and that she wasn't just a fragile lady from the East. I know who did this, she whispered, her voice trembling. Caleb nodded and sat down across from her. He didn't ask questions, he didn't say he was sorry. He just looked at her, his eyes full of understanding and calm. That was all she needed at that moment. But her relief was short-lived. A few seconds later, a new sound reached them. Not the sound of hooves, but something else. The crack of a branch very close by. Caleb instantly stood up, his hand on his revolver. They had been found. The snap of a dry twig that broke the silence was not just a sound, it was a verdict. Caleb, moving with lightning speed, instantly pushed Eleanor deeper into the cave, pinning her against the cold stone wall. He drew his revolver and aimed it at the entrance. Almost immediately, in the weak light of the campfire, shadows appeared. There were two of them. They didn't make a single unnecessary move. their eyes carefully scanning every corner, their steps silent. Eleanor had to curl up, clutching the papers to her chest. She felt the ground shake from the pounding of her own heart. Her world, full of balls and receptions, had suddenly been replaced by a world where every sound could mean death. Her fear was so great she could barely breathe, but seeing the calmness on Caleb's face, she found the strength to compose herself. He was like a stone wall against which all danger broke. The first attacker, a tall, broad-shouldered man, entered the cave. Caleb fired, and the echo of the shot resounded off the rocks. The man cried out and fell, dropping his shotgun. The second, hearing the shot, didn't risk it and retreated into the darkness. Caleb rushed after him, but he was already far away. He didn't want to get into a prolonged fight in the dark. He knew they would return, but not so carelessly. They would come with reinforcements and be more cautious. "We have to go, right now," Caleb said, his voice low and commanding. He didn't wait for a response. He just grabbed a bag, quickly packed the essentials, and hurried to the exit. Eleanor, as if waking from a dream, followed him. She couldn't believe she had just seen a person get shot, but now she had no time for fear. She had to survive. They left the cave and, grabbing Colt, hurried deep into the canyon. This time, Caleb didn't run. He walked quickly but cautiously, holding her hand. He understood that she wasn't used to this pace of life and gave her a chance to catch her breath. She, in turn, felt a new strength growing within her. The pain she was experiencing no longer paralyzed her. On the contrary, it tempered her. After a few miles, they stopped at the base of a large hill. Caleb looked around and, making sure there was no danger, sat down. "We can't stay in one place anymore," he said, his voice serious. "They now know we're here and will be looking for us all over the area. We have to get to Fort Smith. It's the only way to save you and your inheritance. There's a land office there, and your father, as far as I know, had influence there." Eleanor looked at him, her face focused. She wasn't thinking about how to survive, but how to get revenge. "I know," she said. "I know my father was an influential man, but he also made many enemies. I never thought one of them would be my uncle." Her voice wavered, but she quickly regained her composure. "I won't let him take what is rightfully mine, and I won't let him dishonor my father's memory." In her eyes, which had recently been full of pain and fear, a spark was now igniting. It was a spark of hope, hope that justice would prevail, and that she could prove to everyone that she was strong. She looked at Caleb, her only ally in this wild and cruel world. "Will you help me?" she asked. Caleb, looking into her eyes, saw not just fear, but unwavering resolve. He knew this woman wouldn't break. "I can't guarantee your safety, but I know these lands like the back of my hand," he said. "We'll have to go through Fire Creek Canyon. It's the most dangerous route, but it's also the shortest. No one will be waiting for us there." He explained the details of their route to her. They had a difficult and long journey ahead, through canyons, deserted plains, and mountains. Eleanor listened to him carefully, asking questions that seemed to come to her on their own. She was no longer the fragile lady who had fallen from the wagon. She was a woman fighting for her life. She understood that a long and dangerous journey awaited them, but hope was born in her heart. She realized she had a chance. She had Caleb, who knew what to do. She had the papers that proved she was right, and she had her own will, which, as it turned out, was much stronger than she could have imagined. "What do we do next?" she asked, and there was no longer fear in her voice, just pure determination. Caleb nodded and pointed to his bag. "We need to get food and water, and there's only one way to do it without being detected," he said. "We'll have to get to the nearest abandoned ranch. We can find everything we need there, but we have to be very careful." He explained that it was an old ranch that had once belonged to his family, and it had been abandoned for many years. He knew there was a stash there that would help them on their way. This stash was his last hope when he left his family many years ago, and now it could serve her. As they set off, Eleanor no longer stumbled. She walked confidently, step by step, as if she had always known this path. Her pain was still with her, but now it was not the pain of a victim, but the pain of a warrior. She knew they had a chance, and she was ready to fight for it. She tightly squeezed Caleb's hand, and together they walked toward their destiny. The journey to Caleb's ranch was no less brutal than their previous escape. The sun hung in the sky like a blazing disc, and every step was difficult. The deserted plain stretched to the horizon, and only sparse thickets of cacti and scorched grass broke the monotony of the landscape. Eleanor, despite her exhaustion, walked without complaining. Her will stronger than ever. She held her precious cargo, the papers, in her hand, and felt they had become heavier, as if they contained all the weight of her new life. Caleb walked ahead, his gaze fixed on the horizon. He was focused and collected. His courage and calmness instilled in Eleanor the confidence she so desperately lacked. In this lifeless land, she felt trapped, but his presence and his knowledge of these lands gave her hope for salvation. He told her stories about the Wild West, about how people lived on ranches, and about how nature here was both a blessing and a curse. He spoke quietly, but every word was weighty. Finally, the outlines of a ranch appeared on the horizon. It wasn't just an abandoned place, but a real ghost town. Crumbling cabins, a leaning stable, and the main house, which seemed about to collapse. "This was my family's ranch," Caleb said, his voice sounding hollow. "We left here 10 years ago, when the drought happened. Most people left, and only my family stayed. But then, when my father died, I went on a journey alone. This place, it was my hope, my last refuge." There was a deep sadness in his voice. Eleanor, without asking unnecessary questions, simply took his hand. She felt his pain and understood that he, like her, had experienced loss. In this place, her heart was filled with compassion for him, and then with determination. He led her to the very depths of the ranch, to the stash he said was hidden in the basement. When they entered the house, the air was stale and dusty, and a thick layer of dust lay on the floor. Eleanor, looking around, saw old photographs on the wall. In one, there was a young Caleb, and in another, his whole family. She looked at him, and her eyes held not just sympathy, but complete understanding. "I never thought I would be here," she said. "This world, it's completely unlike what I'm used to. But here, I feel alive, and I'm not afraid anymore." Her voice was firm, and a spark of resolve shone in her eyes. They went down to the basement, where Caleb found the stash. Inside were water, canned goods, and an old rifle, which he immediately took in his hands. "We have to be careful. No one has been here for years," he said. At that moment, when they were in relative safety, Eleanor decided to ask a question. "What happened to your family? Why are you alone?" Caleb nodded and told her his story. His father, like hers, was a respected man, but his ranch was at the center of a land dispute, and he was killed. It was so long ago that Caleb no longer remembered the killers' faces, but he remembered their inhumanity, and he realized that his story and Eleanor's were similar. "We're not just being chased by robbers, we're being chased by people who want to take what is rightfully ours," Eleanor said, her voice full of anger and determination. At that moment, they realized their fates were intertwined. Suddenly, a sound reached them that made both of them freeze. The sound of a door opening. They were here. They were inside the house. Caleb and Eleanor looked at each other. There was no fear in his eyes, only cold, calculated anger. There was no fear in her eyes either. There was only resolve. "What do we do?" she whispered. Caleb smiled and pointed upstairs. "We don't need to hide. We've been waiting for them." They went upstairs and, using their knowledge of the area, began to move. Caleb was in front, Eleanor behind, ready to help at any moment. They heard footsteps in the house, and there were several of them, but they were ready. Caleb knew every corner of this house, every crack, every shadow. He was ready to fight. They waited for their enemies to approach, and when they entered the room, they were ready. Their enemies were 3 men, led by a tall, thin man with a black mustache. He was dressed in expensive but dusty clothes. This was Silas. When he saw them, he sneered. "We heard you were here. I didn't think you'd be foolish enough to hide in a place like this." He was confident of his victory, but he didn't know they were ready to fight. Caleb, without a word, fired the rifle. The shot was accurate, and Silas fell, wounded in the shoulder. The two other men, stunned by the sudden attack, rushed at them, but Eleanor, grabbing an old kerosene lamp, threw it aside. It exploded, and flames engulfed the room. The men cried out and retreated, and Caleb, using the chaos, dealt with them. They were wounded but not killed. Silas, lying on the floor, looked at them with hatred. "You think you've won? You're wrong. My master won't forgive you for this. You won't get to Fort Smith," he growled. Caleb, stepping on his chest, sneered. "We'll see." Eleanor, looking at Silas lying on the floor, felt her heart fill with triumph. She had won. She hadn't just survived, she had fought and won. This victory was small, but it gave her the strength to move forward. She realized she had the will and strength to fight for her inheritance. She wasn't just a fragile lady, but a warrior, and she was ready for battle. They searched the ranch, found what they needed, and hurried away, leaving the burning house and their enemies behind. A long and dangerous journey lay ahead of them, but now they walked not as victims, but as victors. Their triumph was the first step on the path to justice, and they were ready to walk that path to the end. The path to Fort Smith became for Eleanor and Caleb not just a road, but a symbol of their new, shared journey. They walked side by side, their steps in sync. Caleb shared his knowledge of the stars, wild animals, and how to survive in this wild but beautiful land. Eleanor, in turn, told him about her dreams and what her father was like. They were both lonely, and this road, full of dangers and hardships, became a moment for them to find each other. Arriving in Fort Smith, they saw a completely different world. It was a city full of life, with bustling streets, shops, and houses. Eleanor, accustomed to luxury, was amazed by this simple but energetic place. Caleb, in turn, felt uncomfortable in the hustle and bustle, but he didn't leave her for a minute. His hand was always at the ready. He knew that not only people, but also dangers awaited them in this city. They went straight to the land office. It was a large, old building where all the papers were kept in huge cabinets, and many people were waiting for their turn. When they entered, they saw what they expected to her uncle. Nathaniel Vance was there. He was standing by the window, talking to one of the clerks. His face was full of smugness, and when he saw Eleanor, he smiled as if nothing had happened. "Eleanor, my dear, you're alive," he said, his voice full of feigned concern. "I was so worried about you. Your wagon. It's just terrible." But there wasn't a single tear in his eyes. Eleanor, without letting him finish, walked up to him and, raising her head, looked him straight in the eyes. "Uncle, I know it was you. I know you arranged all this to take my father's lands. I have proof." Her voice was firm, and there wasn't a hint of fear in it. Nathaniel, sneering, showed her a stack of papers. "My dear, you're mistaken. Your father, unfortunately, left everything to me. Look." He showed her papers on which her father's signature was present, and it was clearly written that all his lands belonged to Nathaniel. Caleb, standing next to her, clenched his fists, but Eleanor, without flinching, looked at her uncle. "You're lying. This is a forgery. You knew I would find these lands, and you wanted to get ahead of me, but you couldn't. I have the originals." She pulled out the documents she had been carefully guarding for so long. Nathaniel, seeing them, turned pale. He realized his plan had failed. You can't prove this. I just hired people to find you, to help you." But his voice was no longer so confident. Eleanor, not waiting for an answer, addressed everyone in the room. She spoke as if she had been giving public speeches her whole life. Her voice was full of power and conviction. "I am Eleanor Vance, daughter of George Vance, and I am here to prove that my uncle, Nathaniel Vance, forged these papers to take my inheritance. He not only wanted to take away everything I had, but also wanted to kill me. He hired people who sabotaged my wagon and pursued me all over Texas, and he wanted to take not only my land, but also my life." She showed everyone the documents, and determination was written on her face. The people in the room who witnessed this scene were astonished. They looked at Nathaniel, and then at Eleanor, who was the embodiment of strength and courage. They saw not just anger in her eyes but resolve. She spoke of her pain, her suffering, her struggle, and she spoke of her hope. Nathaniel, realizing his plan had failed, tried to run away, but Caleb, reacting instantly, stopped him. He squeezed his arm, and Nathaniel cried out and fell. "That's for what you did to her," Caleb said. When the sheriff arrived, he heard Eleanor's story and, seeing the documents, arrested Nathaniel. He was shamed and humiliated. His plan had failed. Several months later, Eleanor and Caleb returned to the lands that now belonged to her. They didn't sell them. Instead, they decided to build a new city on them, a city that would be founded on justice, equality, and honesty. Caleb became her faithful comrade and partner. He oversaw the construction, and she was in charge of the administration. They built a new city, and this city became a symbol that even in the wildest and most cruel world, you can find kindness and justice. Eleanor, who was once a fragile lady, became a strong, wise, and determined woman. She learned to shoot, ride a horse, and survive in the wild. And she realized that her strength was not in her wealth but in her spirit. She looked at Caleb, who was standing beside her, and smiled. He was her hope, her support, her partner. They had overcome all hardships together and built a new world together. She realized that the greatest inspiration she had received in this life was not in money, but in love and friendship. Their story became a legend that inspired people, a story of a fragile woman who dared to defy fate and build her own happiness, and of the man who helped her do it. Their story was a story of how injustice can become a source of strength, and pain a source of inspiration, and this was the greatest legacy they left behind.